what separates a fighter from a brawler. There is a quiet truth about Ken Norton that every veteran inside heavyweight boxing already understands. For all the championship belts, for all the wars under the bright lights, there were men he simply could not stand to see across the ring, and he never spoke about them publicly. Not once. At 70, the silence began to feel heavier than the punches. Ken Norton was not built for noise. He was built for structure. A former Marine who believed respect was earned through pain, not performance. Inside the ring, he stood tall, arms folded across his chest, daring men to test his will. Outside of it, he rarely complained, rarely explained, and never chased sympathy. But the heavyweight division of the 1970s was not just about power. It was about politics. It was about attention. It was about who the cameras chose to love. There were nights when he believed he had done enough. There were verdicts that never sat right. There were careers that rose while his seemed to stall. He carried those moments quietly. No headlines, no accusations, just memory. Resentment in boxing does not explode. It hardens. And by the time he turned 70, Ken Norton understood that some rivalries never truly end. They simply go unspoken. Before we move into the list, we need to remember who Ken Norton truly is. Ken Norton was born in 1943 in Jacksonville, Illinois, long before anyone imagined he would one day stand across from the most famous fighters on earth. He did not enter boxing as a prodigy. He entered it as a disciplined man. Before the belts and the bright lights, there was the United States Marine Corps. That background shaped everything about him. The posture, the restraint, the refusal to show weakness. When Norton turned professional in the late 1960s, he did not look like the typical heavyweight star. He was not flashy. He did not charm reporters. What he brought instead was structure, a cross-arm defensive style that confused opponents and frustrated commentators. He absorbed punishment differently. He waited. He measured. Then he answered. In 1973, he shocked the world by defeating the most celebrated heavyweight of the era and breaking his opponent's jaw in the process. That single night proved something important. Norton was not just a contender. He belonged among the elite. Over the next several years, he would fight the very best, pushing champions to razor-thin decisions and surviving wars that would have broken lesser men. In 1978, he became the WBC heavyweight champion. On paper, that should have sealed his place in history. Yet even at the top, Norton carried a sense that he was never fully embraced. He was respected for his strength, feared for his durability, but rarely adored. Other men commanded the headlines. Other men became icons. Inside locker rooms, veterans knew how dangerous he was. They knew his strength was real. They knew he did not fold under pressure. But outside the ropes, the narrative often drifted elsewhere. By the time he reached 70, Norton had long stopped chasing applause. What remained were the memories, the close verdicts, the missed chances, the names that lingered. And now, we move into the list. Number 5. Muhammad Ali. Some rivalries are built on noise. This one was built on collision. When Ken Norton first stepped into the ring against Muhammad Ali in 1973, he was not the headline. He was supposed to be another test, another defense, another chapter in someone else's legend. But that night did not unfold the way the script predicted. Norton fought with structure, patience, and force. He disrupted rhythm. He closed space. He did not chase the spectacle. He controlled it. By the final bell, he had done more than win a decision. He had broken something physical and symbolic. He proved that the most celebrated fighter of the era could be hurt, pressured, and beaten. But in boxing, victory is only part of the equation. Narrative is the rest. The rematches that followed were tighter, more tactical, and infinitely more political. Commentators leaned one way, judges leaned another. Norton walked away from at least one of those nights convinced that what he had done between the ropes had not been reflected on paper. Ali remained the global icon. The cameras followed him. The history books centered him. Norton remained the disciplined challenger, the man who pushed greatness, but was rarely placed beside it. That imbalance stayed with him. It was not personal bitterness. It was something colder. He believed he had earned equal standing in those battles. Instead, he became part of another man's story. Years later, Norton would admit that some verdicts never leave a fighter. They echo longer than punches. Facing Ali did not just test his skill, it tested his place in history, and for Ken Norton, that question of place never fully settled. Number 4. Larry Holmes. Time is the only opponent no heavyweight ever defeats. By the time Ken Norton stepped into the ring in 1978 for the WBC heavyweight title, the division was shifting beneath his feet. The era of spectacle was fading, and a new standard of precision was emerging. Larry Holmes represented that shift, younger, sharper, carrying a piston-like jab that many insiders already whispered was the best in the sport. For Norton, this was not just another championship bout, it was validation. After years of fighting legends, surviving wars, and living inside narrow scorecards, this was his opportunity to cement authority without controversy. He entered the ring knowing that this might be the last true summit of his career. The fight itself was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was disciplined, tactical, brutally competitive. Holmes established distance with the jab. Norton answered with pressure and structure. Round after round, neither man broke. There were no collapses, no theatrical momentum swings, only calculation and endurance. When the final bell rang, the tension inside the arena felt heavier than any knockout. The judges returned a split decision. Holmes walked away with the title. Norton stood still, absorbing the verdict the way he absorbed punches. To many observers, it was one of the closest heavyweight championship fights of the decade. To Norton, it was something else entirely. He believed he had done enough. He believed he had matched youth with experience and precision with will. But the scorecards did not bend in his favor. Holmes became the standard of the next era. The man who would dominate the late 1970s and early 1980s, Norton became the champion who briefly held the belt and then lost it in a fight so narrow that it still fuels debate. There was no public outburst, no accusations. That was not Norton's style. But in later reflections, he would admit that certain decisions cut deeper because of timing. He was not losing to a fading legend. He was losing to the future. For a fighter who had spent his prime battling icons, this loss symbolized something more painful than defeat. It signaled transition. The division was moving forward without him at the center. Holmes did nothing dishonorable. He fought brilliantly. Yet for Norton, that night represented the moment when effort was no longer enough to outrun time. Some rivalries are about personality. This one was about inevitability. And inevitability is something Ken Norton never learned to accept easily. Number 3. George Foreman. Sometimes the rivalry that burns the longest is the one that never happens. In the early 1970s, the heavyweight division revolved around destruction. One man in particular was flattening contenders with frightening efficiency. Opponents were not merely beaten. They were dismantled. Every knockout amplified the aura. Every fallen body reinforced the myth. Ken Norton watched closely. Styles make fights, and insiders often debated how Norton's cross-arm defense and physical strength would fare against that kind of raw power. Trainers speculated. Reporters imagined scenarios. The public expected the collision to happen sooner rather than later. But it never did. Opportunities shifted. Rankings moved. Promoters recalculated risk and reward. While others were granted their shots, Norton found himself circling the edge of contention, waiting for a call that never arrived. That absence lingered. Foreman's rise reshaped the division. His dominance forced everyone else to adjust strategy, psychology, even career planning. For Norton, the frustration was not fear, it was exclusion. He believed he had earned the right to test himself against the most physically intimidating force of the era. Instead, he watched from a distance as the narrative unfolded without him. Later in his career, when Foreman reinvented himself and returned as a different kind of champion, the conversation resurfaced. What would have happened had they met in their primes? Would Norton's discipline have neutralized brute strength? Or would power have overwhelmed structure? Norton never publicly criticized the situation. He did not accuse anyone of avoidance. But in interviews years later, there was a subtle edge when the topic arose, a sense that something unfinished remained. In boxing, legacy is built not only on victories, but on who you faced. Certain matchups define eras. Certain clashes settle arguments forever. Norton carried the weight of knowing that one of those defining moments slipped through his hands. Foreman became a two-time heavyweight champion, a cultural phenomenon, and eventually a symbol of redemption. Norton remained the man who fought nearly everyone important in his era, yet missed this one crucial collision. There is a particular kind of resentment reserved for unanswered questions. Not anger, not hostility, just the quiet belief that history denied you a proving ground. For Ken Norton, the rivalry with George Foreman was not forged in punches, It was forged in absence, and absence, in boxing, can echo just as loudly as a knockout. Number 2. Joe Frazier. Heavyweight boxing in the 1970s was not just a sport, it was a hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy stood two names that defined the era in the public imagination. Their rivalry consumed headlines, divided loyalties, and became larger than the belts themselves. Ken Norton fought inside that same division, bled on the same canvas, and pushed the same limits. Yet he often found himself positioned just outside that central narrative. Joe Frazier represented something deeply rooted in American boxing culture: relentless pressure, blue-collar identity, a left hook that carried both force and symbolism. When Frazier stepped forward, the crowd felt it. When he collided with his greatest rival, the world stopped to watch. Norton respected that, but respect does not eliminate comparison. Within training camps and analyst circles, there were constant debates about where Norton truly ranked among the elite. Some argued his style would frustrate anyone. Others insisted he lacked the defining moment that secured mythic status. Even when he achieved major victories and claimed a version of the heavyweight championship, the conversation rarely centered on him first. That dynamic hardened over time. It was not that Frazier wronged him directly. There was no public insult, no personal betrayal. The tension lived in perception. Frazier's place in history seemed fixed, reinforced by unforgettable wars and cultural symbolism. Norton's place felt conditional, dependent on close scorecards and shifting narratives. He had gone through the same battles. He had absorbed the same punishment. Yet when historians revisited the era, the spotlight rarely lingered on him for long. In private reflections, Norton acknowledged that being cast as the third pillar of an era can feel heavier than being excluded entirely. You are close enough to greatness to touch it, but not close enough to define it. Frazier became immortalized through epic trilogies and defining showdowns. Norton carried the quieter legacy of pushing champions to their limits without receiving equal myth. There is a specific kind of rivalry that grows not from hatred, but from proximity. Standing near legends, knowing you belong among them, yet sensing the narrative drifting elsewhere. For Ken Norton, Joe Frazier symbolized that proximity. The feeling of being part of something historic, yet never quite owning the center of it. And sometimes, in boxing, being almost equal is the most frustrating position of all. Number 1. Leon Spinks. In heavyweight boxing, nothing unsettles a division faster than chaos. In 1978, the structure of the championship picture seemed clear. Established contenders had paid their dues. Veterans had endured wars. Rankings reflected years of sacrifice. Then, almost overnight, that order fractured. Leon Spinks entered the scene with limited professional experience, but immense confidence. He moved quickly through the ranks and, in a stunning upset, defeated the most recognizable name in the sport to claim the heavyweight title. The shock reverberated through every training camp in America. For Ken Norton, the timing could not have been more volatile. He had spent the better part of a decade battling the very best. He had absorbed punishment from elite contenders, survived razor-thin decisions, and waited patiently for the kind of opportunity that legitimizes a legacy beyond debate. Suddenly, the title landscape was unstable. Rematches were arranged. Politics shifted. The belt changed hands in ways that felt abrupt. Spinks became the face of unpredictability. Young, brash, and propelled by a single seismic victory, he altered the trajectory of the division. To some fans, it was thrilling. To veterans who had climbed the long road step by step, it felt disruptive. Norton believed in hierarchy. He believed in earning position through repetition and proof. The notion that one night could rewrite the order of heavyweights clashed with his sense of structure. He did not dismiss Spinks's talent, but he questioned the speed at which acclaim followed. When rematches and title negotiations unfolded, Norton watched as momentum bypassed the steady veterans in favor of spectacle. The championship picture no longer felt anchored to longevity. It felt tethered to surprise. There was no personal animosity. Norton never framed it that way. But in later years, he admitted that the instability of that period left a lasting impression. Careers are fragile in boxing. Windows close quickly. When order dissolves at the wrong moment, opportunity dissolves with it. Spinks symbolized that disruption. The reminder that in heavyweight boxing, years of discipline can be overshadowed by a single unexpected result. For Ken Norton, this was the deepest frustration of all. Not a controversial decision, not a stylistic clash, but the realization that the path he had followed so carefully could be rerouted by forces beyond his control. Some fighters resent men, others resent moments. Ken Norton never built his legacy through volume. He built it through resistance. He stood across from giants and did not blink. He absorbed punishment and answered with structure. He chased respect, not applause, and perhaps that is why the rivalries he carried were not dramatic feuds, but quiet reckonings. At 70, when the noise of the sport had faded, what remained were not belts or headlines. It was clarity. He understood that boxing is not just about who wins. It is about who is remembered first. Some fighters become symbols, some become chapters inside someone else's story. Norton refused to see himself that way. He did not hate easily. He remembered deeply. And in the end, the 5 men he named were not just opponents, they were mirrors, each reflecting a different challenge to his pride, his timing, or his place in history. Some fighters win popularity, some win longevity. Ken Norton fought for something harder to secure: respect.